Jumping into our Godot project, we have a fairly simple setup. We just have a testing world that has a flat plane, a wall, and our player character. And the player character itself just has fairly basic FPS movement, to where we have our camera moving by the mouse, we have W, A, S, and D moving our character, and then we can sprint for shift. There's not much to it. If you do want to learn more, I'll put a link, you can find that in the top right, to look at a video where I talk about that a little bit more in detail. But more importantly, if we take a look at our file system, we have some items. We have a frying pan, a rolling pin, and a whisk that are just basic 3D meshes. And then we have our weapons as well, which are just different blasters. Now, all of these assets are coming from Kenny's assets, so I'll throw links into the description to where I got each set of these. One is from one asset pack, one is from another. Our goal is to make these objects that when I am actually running around in first person, I'll be able to see them on screen as if I'm holding them in my hand. Now, for something like this, we do have, say, 5, and we could just go through manually, and we could create a scene. We could then create a script for that scene and call out things like the actual mesh that we're using. We could call out any other details about them. So since we're thinking about items as a whole, we might do that model, we might do position, and we might do rotation. In our case, if we bring things in and they're rotated the wrong way, or we need to reposition them in our player's hands. The easiest way for us to actually do this, though, is with resources. Now, resources in Godot can represent a lot of things, but ultimately they're just data. Now for this, what we'll want to do is we just want to create a new script, and we're going to define our own resource. Now we're going to call this one item because we want this to be every single item that we're going to be putting in our hand. So this is going to be a very broad strokes representation. With it created, we'll open this thing up, and by default, because we didn't change anything, it's going to be extending node. But in our case, we're making a custom resource, so we'll have it extend resource. And then at this point, we can give it a name, and we'll say class underscore name. And for us, this is just our generic item, so we will call it item. So saving this just as item, extending resource, means that if I go anywhere inside of my tree, we create a new, and we create a new resource, we're going to be able to create a brand new item, and it will be an iteration of what we're creating here inside of this to allow us to define new information. This also means that we can define defaults that apply for every single thing throughout our item resource. So if we wanted to have a set scale for some reason, or a set property, we can define that in our top level item and work from there. But we don't want to do that. We want everything to be unique at this point, so we can start to add our variables. And in this case, we're going to use export variables because that just allows me to have, again, this be very generic and me to define things however I want. So we'll export. We're going to export a variable, and this is just going to be our model. Now for this, we could just leave this blank and let the interpretation come in when we actually drag something into our model variable. But we can define this even further, and we're going to say this is a pack scene. Now this pack scene is going to allow us to bring in a lot of different things. It could be our mesh specifically, or it could actually be an entire scene inside of Godot. Some of the other things that we might want to define for every single item, we're going to export out our position, and this will be a vector 3. And then similarly, we are going to export out our rotation, which is also going to be a vector 3. And to define our very basic, very generic item resource, this is all we need. I can save this, and then inside of my items folder, if I create a new resource, we're going to make sure again that we're creating an item, and this will be our first whisk item. So it's just going to save it as a TRES or a resource file type, and we save that. So now inside of our items folder, we're going to have a whisks.tres. If I click on it, over here on the right-hand side of my screen, in my inspector, I have where I can set up the export variables for that item. And then that all means that we can go into our items, go into our models, grab our whisk, and that is now being stored inside of that whisk resource that we have our 3D model. We won't be able to set our position or rotation just yet because we're still working through some things that we need to finish up here. But as far as setting this up, that's all that's really needed. The only problem is we're not using this resource for anything yet. So now let's talk about how we use this to put it maybe in an inventory or allow us to hold it in our hand. To do this, we'll jump over into the actual player character script that controls all my logic right now for the actual player. We're going to need to set up a reference, some variable that we can call that's going to have our item resource. Now, there are a couple ways that we can approach this. In this case, we're going to use an export variable, once again, just so that way we can easily drag and drop this in the editor and not have to actually set the discrete path. So we're going to call this just our item because we're just keeping it fairly basic right now. Again, we could leave this blank and we could just let the software figure it out, but we can also define what type we're looking for. Just like we did previously, we were looking for a pack scene. Since we have that custom resource, now we can set that, hey, now we're looking for an item. So if I save this, we go back to my player character. Inside of this, now we have the item that we can go into that location, find the TRES, and our first item there is going to be the whisk. But we run our scene, nothing gonna happen. We have that variable set to our whisk, but we're not actually using it yet. So now let's talk about how we go through to actually do that. Before we start talking about really anything else, let's just focus on getting this one whisk loading in the second that we start our player character. So for this, if we aren't already, let's go back to our player character scene, and we want to define a spawn location for all of our items, some sort of home or an origin position. What I like to do for this is I'll just set some sort of node, and in this case, we'll just go with a pretty generic node 3D. Now, with inside of this node 3D here, then we can drag it and start to reposition it somewhere where our items might typically land. It doesn't really matter where this actually ends up, just somewhere where you would expect an item to actually spawn. In our case, I'm just going to go as if we're right-handed here, and it's going to be somewhere off to the right of the camera. We could leave this as a node 3D, but I like to call this item spawn. And all this means being underneath our player neck and underneath our camera is that as we start to move our camera, these items will follow as well. That was the hard part. Now let's move on to actually scripting this. What I like to do is put everything inside of a load item function. So all the way down at the very bottom, once again, we'll go func load item, and right now we're just going to pass as we have a second to think. Now what we do have to do is we want to take our item that we have saved in our variable. We then want to interrogate it to find whatever that pack scene is underneath it. Then we'll take that pack scene, we'll add a child to our item spawn, and then that will be our item loaded. Before we get any further, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any future updates. Now that we've had a second to think, let's remove this pass and we'll actually start coding. So for this, like I mentioned, we want to take our resource that we have saved and access that pack scene underneath it. So for that, we'll make a new variable just local to this load item scene. I will call this my item model, just so that way we have that reference to it. And this is going to be equal to our item that we had set above. We're then going to take the model variable from inside of that, and we're going to instantiate it. What this will do is it's going to go into our item, grab the model, and then make an instance of that model that then we can use. So then for here, after this, we can grab our item spawn. Now for this first pass, we could just grab this here, grab that quick reference, player neck item spawn, but it's probably a better practice to stick it as a variable up above. But just for this first one here, let's add our child. And the child that we're actually going to be adding is our item model. This is then when we call this load item function, it's going to set our item model equal to item.model.instantiate, so an instantiated version of that, and then spawn in our actual item. For this first one, we'll just go back up to our ready function, and we'll call that load item function. So now when we run our project, we have our whisk there. Now there's two things we're actually going to notice here. One of which is that it's not in the actual right position. The other thing we'll notice is that it's not actually following both of our axes when we're moving our camera. Both of these are actually fairly easy fixes. The first one is that our item spawn actually didn't land underneath our camera 3D. So then we'll just move that. Once we do that, we're going to have to update this reference here. So once again, we should set this to an actual variable, but I'll just drag that in. Now when we do that, our whisk is going to follow. The other thing, if we remember, if we go back to our item resource, we have a position and we have a rotation defined that we can start to set for every single one of these. The easiest way to do this is to go to my player character in 3D. I'll find wherever I have my whisk model, and I'll just add it as a child to my item spawn. And then from here, we can start to rotate it and move it around depending on what we actually need. So I'll do my rotation first. We're going to want to probably go 90. In this case, we'll want to go minus 90 in the Y to flip it around the right way. Maybe on the X, we'll give it none. And then on the Z, we'll have it point up a little bit. And now that's really good. And if we play our main scene again, we see that it's a little bit better. In our case, it's spawning 2 because we still have that 1 auto loading. But I want to move it a little closer. So then we can just start to grab our others and maybe bring it in a little bit. And I think that's pretty decent. It could be tweaked, it could look better, but it's good enough for me. Now the hardest part about this is copying our values from our transform of our actual item spawn to the world and pasting it inside of our property for the position. I'll once again do the same thing, but this time for my rotation. Copy my value and paste that value. So what that should do for us, if I remove my whisk from my character and run our scene, we'll actually notice that it's still in that same position. And that's just because when we're spawning in our item, we need to make a quick reference to those. So one more time, we'll go back to our scripts. We'll go back to the player character, and then inside of this load item function, we'll set our item model's position to that of our item that we have in our hand, dot position. We'll take our item model dot rotation and set that equal to our item dot rotation. And then finally, when we go to run this, our whisk is going to be positioned correctly. Now, if I want to put anything else in, all I have to do is create additional resources for them. So maybe we'll go with a blaster this time, and I'll create a new resource. It's going to be an item. We'll call this one my blaster. Inside of my blaster resource, we want to set our model. Once again, I'll just grab one out of my list. To position it, I'll set it inside of my item spawn. We are rotated the incorrect way, so let's say we're going to go 180, and we'll just play that to see. And I might just want to move it a little bit closer this time as well. Copy my values, go back to my blaster, paste the value, copy my value, and paste it. And then at any point when I go to my player character, all I have to do is grab whatever resource that I want, drop it in, and it's going to spawn everything in the correct position and orientation that I have. This process can then be repeated for all of the other items. This process can already be... This process can then be repeated for all the other items that I might want to add to my game.